To our webinar, Compliant Use of Cloud Technologies in the Life Sciences. My name is Megan McEwen, and I'm the Business Development Manager of Xivion Corporation, which is sponsoring today's session. Xivion is the leading provider of software, services, and consulting for global corporations operating in highly regulated industries. Our unique solutions focus on integrated preclinical lab management, early-stage drug discovery, regulatory compliance, GRC, quality management, and systems validation. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. First of all, everyone has been automatically placed on mute in the webinar, so please feel free to use the questions feature on the GoToWebinar panel to ask questions at any time during today's session. Time permitting, we'll address questions at the end of today's presentation. We will also be using the polling feature during this webinar. I encourage you to participate so that we get the most accurate results. Finally, we are recording today's session to be distributed afterwards via email. And now to introduce today's speaker. As JAF Consulting Incorporated Managing Consultant, Joe Franchetti is an industry leader and teacher for 21 CFR Part 11, Annex 11, HIPAA, software validation, and computer system validation in regulated environments. For over 20 years, Joe has been involved with the development, purchase, installation, operation, and maintenance of computerized systems used in all phases of drug development. In addition, Mr. Franchetti has over 24 years of progressive experience in information technology and data management in the pharmaceutical and life sciences industry. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Megan. I do appreciate the introduction. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to this this wonderful day on Tuesday. We're going to have a fairly chock full of activity going on with this webinar. We're going to look at challenges within the cloud environment. And we're going to look a little bit more in depth of cloud computing, some depending on your level of expertise and knowledge within the cloud technologies. May have seen a couple of the graphics that were presented before, but to provide a foundation. Then we're going to look at what the driving factors are to the adoption of cloud technologies, and more importantly, why aren't folks moving to those cloud technologies? We're also going to look at cloud computing and trying to equate that to our traditional outsourcing models within the pharmaceutical industry. Then lastly, we're going to look at the different points to consider on implementing a cloud-based application or technology within your organization, some of the things to consider. And then last but not least, we'll look through a brief summary of our activities. So first, we're going to look at a general poll. So I'm going to find out how many of those that are online, 17 of us, how many are using the cloud right now. So Megan, if you could open up that poll. There we go. Take a couple seconds to answer that. Okay, and close that up. See how our results fare. So, good number are using it both, on personal and professional levels. Good 30% of us are not using cloud technologies at all, which is fairly interesting considering there's a lot of those technologies out there that we may be using. So let's look at some of these challenges that we're focused with in the cloud environment. So in a lot of different instances, the overall user groups and user community needs to develop on how they're going to use this cloud technology. In a lot of cases, that's a challenge because there are a lot of different individuals that are a part of that. And understanding that cloud computing is still in its early development stage, and there really aren't any standards on their side yet, which would be crucial to the adoption within the regulated industry. Secondly, the standard strategy for compliance with cloud certainly can be elusive. Each of us have unique set of circumstances that we need to comply with, different regulations, different user type requirements, and not every cloud offering can meet those particular challenges that we all produce. So there's a lot of different ways to augment these particular standards of complying with cloud technologies. So we need to look at security and what is the best cost-effective measure to move forward into these types of technologies. And with anything, and especially in the pharmaceutical industry, a number, identifying all those different risks on how we're going to use this and how we're going to comply with, not only, the local regulations that we need to comply with and meet, but also our own internal standards in which we need to meet. So there's also a lot of international challenges here, and we talk about these based on the different organizations and their participation in many different countries. A lot of the US-based pharmaceutical organizations have presence in Europe, and there's a lot of restriction on personal identifiable health information and the movement of this data between other countries outside the EU, as well as data going through Japan and Germany and the UK and all throughout the world. So that's one of the driving forces, but secondary to that is the ability, if we do implement cloud technologies, how do we do our due diligence? How do we verify that these organizations are brick and mortar establishments and that can substantially meet our requirements overall for the pharmaceutical industry? So to conduct those due diligence audits is extremely, extremely difficult. So a couple of different definitions of what the cloud is, but it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for the most part, cloud computing is a compilation of existing technologies and techniques packaged with an infrastructure paradigm that offers improved scalability and elasticity, greater business agility, faster startup time, reduced management costs, and just-in-time availability of resources. So what we're doing, we're moving that computing functionality from a particular product. Now we're offering it up as a service. What we're going to look at here is the traditional IT structures versus cloud computing, and what we typically look at is an acquisition model. In our traditional sources, we buy assets and we build our architecture internally. What we're doing now is buying services with that cloud technology. From a business model, we're paying for our fixed assets, and all of our administrative overhead, all of the resources need to support that infrastructure. Now we're using a pay-as-you-go process. Pay for what we use. That's vastly different. Our access, previously you had to be within the confines of your organization. Now any device can access through the internet. And lastly, we have a technical model, and we'll talk about this briefly, is a single tenant, a single instance of a particular server, very selfish, very static. When we move to the cloud-based environments, and here's some of the challenges when we talk about the pharmaceutical industry, is multi-tenant, shared, dynamic, and elastic services that certainly will provide a lot of challenges for us. And I think from the technical model, everything else is easy to chew. Acquisition, business, and access model is fairly easy to chew from a regulated perspective. The technical model is where we stumble a little bit in the pharmaceutical industry and regulated industries. Our basic cloud computing types, when we look at our larger cloud substance here in with the overall public cloud that's out there. And then you start combining that with a very private and internal organization and internal cloud environment, and then you have a hybrid of the two. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Now we want to look at who's in control of these different services within these cloud environments. And in the previous slide we looked at that public cloud, and we're going to focus on that public cloud a little bit more. When you look at the dedicated IT, your own internal dedicated IT resources, all of these green boxes here are all controlled by your sponsor, by your individual organizations. The last one, network, that's if you're bringing in you're going to bring in the internet into this process. So that's a sponsor and service provider shared control. You don't have full control over your internet service provider. Everything else in a dedicated IT environment, you do have that control. As we move to, say, a hosting provider where we provide, or acquire services for server storage and network, we have joint control over those particular processes, but we still control the majority of everything else that's out there. Now as we start moving into our public cloud and our infrastructure as a service, the IaaS model, where you have your no control over your servers, your storage, or your network, but you do have some control over your virtualization and operating systems. You're still maintaining control over your data, which is very important, all the different middleware that's out there, and the processing components. You do have control over that with the runtime. As you move into your platform as a service, again, you start losing a little bit of control, and as you get into your public software as a service, your larger applications that are out there, and a lot of us do use them, based on our previous polling question. There's Netflix out there, and you look at that, and that's some case where we don't have any control over our data. But there's other software as a service out there that you do have control, and a lot of that could be, say, storage capabilities. If you have iCloud or Dropbox or Google Drive, you have access to your data and you have somewhat control over your data, but you could stand to lose that data if you're not protected. So again, this is a very good graphic to show where that control is and who maintains that control, and as you get further into that public software as a service type process, you lose a lot of that control. This next model is going to look at a few deployment models. We talked about the public, the hybrid, and the private clouds. As we move in from a private cloud into a public cloud, the economies of scale are much, much greater, much more ability to sell those types of services. But as you move from public out to private, you gain more control and more governance over that process, which is extremely important to understand. And again, as we lay all these different services on top of these models, level of abstraction is increased as you move out into the software as a service, and the flexibility of the purpose. You're very rigid and locked into how a software functions and behaves with that software as a service product. So it's again another graphic to show you, the different deployment models and where you're losing and gaining control throughout this process. A lot of the main component of cloud computing deals with virtualization, and it's extremely important to the overall concept of cloud computing, and provides access to a single underlying hardware component, server, such as the server, and coordinates that server so that you can have multiple operating systems working within that particular server. Very, very important, because as these organizations grow, servers are underutilized for the most part. 10 to 15% of their overall processing capability are utilized when servers are running. And that's not all that great. So you figure you can fit a good 6 or 7 processes running at 10 to 15% on a particular server. You know, and in your particular organization or organizations that you've worked in, you may have seen the overall size of that data center increase. You know, back in the mid-'80s, early '90s, those data centers were entire floors, and bringing in different servers, and they just ran out of space, as well as the power that's required to operate each one of these particular server farms and so forth. And along with the sheer numbers of overall servers comes the administrative costs that are tied into that. So virtualization becomes very, very important in this process to reduce the size, reduce the burden of administrative costs, reduce power, and you know, more importantly, increase that processing capability of the core components that you're working with. Earlier we talked about single tenant and multi-tenant architecture, and one way we can look at this is that you know, a multi-tenancy refers to the principles of software architecture where a single instance of the software runs on a server serving multiple client organizations. So you're running a single application such as Salesforce or a clinical trial management system, and that software is supposed to support every different client that comes in there. Well, that's all well and good, but it doesn't, you know, necessarily drive, you know, what happens when neighbors are conflicting or there's questions of conflict of interest. It really doesn't handle that. But there are multi-instance architectures where separate software instances are operating on behalf of different client organizations. So you're separating those houses a little bit. So you're going from an apartment complex down to a condominium of sorts, and you know, you're able to manage each of those different organizations as just a little bit better, and applications and instances just a little bit better. You know, so but the big concern here is, you know, how do we provide a separation between all of these different tenants? And you know, we don't know who our neighbors are in this case, or what their overall objective are. You know, they could have some very interesting uses for the same type of software that may be conflicting with how you're using it, and may draw a little bit more resource from that system, which could certainly impact your overall performance on your process. So it's a little bit on single tenant and multi-tenant architectures that are out there. So let's look a little bit about the cloud, you know, drive. Who's driving this this process, you know, or who's driving into this technology that we're looking at here? So a lot of different driving, you know, forces. You know, cost and scalability is the biggest drive for that public cloud. You know, the more people they can sign into iCloud, the more cost effective it is. They certainly may need to increase their storage and storage capabilities, but it certainly is the biggest driver. It can reduce costs, keep costs relatively low. However, there is a big obstacle when you do look at this in the public cloud. You run into security and privacy concerns. You know, who's looking at my data, and what's their intent in looking at that data? Can they take that data away from me? Can they delete that data? So it's certainly a concern, but the cost and scalability is trying to drive it. However, when we look at our pharmaceutical and life science and regulated industries, we're focusing more toward that private cloud, which will address that privacy and security component. But cloud providers are also looking at it. They're not going to have the same amount of subscribers to that private cloud, so their costs also increase. In a lot of cases, we're also looking at this, the big data, the big processing of data, and mobile technologies and social media. They drive for that consumption of IT, and all the resources that go along with it. So yeah, you have, opposing forces in some cases trying to get into different types of technologies. Big data and social networking is not necessarily going to be into a private cloud. Mobile technologies, very, very amenable to that private cloud technology. There have been many published statistics on the growth of cloud services, and IDC here, statistics are just one of them. The value of these services increase with certainly the number of players who are in the space. And what we're going to be doing is, moving away from that value of economics to niche services and niche process that's going to be adopted for the drive to this technology. Who can tailor a niche market? And as we have Microsoft Azure, we have IBM, and there are a number of other cloud services that are marketing the private cloud and the niche service of the pharmaceutical industry. Certainly, we're going to see a lot more of those players as time goes on. So what are some of those impediments in moving to the cloud technologies? What we have are we have a lot of applications that we use on our laptops, our desktops, even within our server and our enterprise. And in a lot of cases, these applications just aren't ready yet to move into the cloud technology and software as a service process, mainly because the service level agreements are pretty much dictating how that can happen. So that's one of the drive as to why all of these applications aren't moving right to the cloud. There's application readiness is one of them. Security and privacy, as we know, that's they're becoming more and more important. Data is sensitive, and data breaches present a significant risk to organizations, as we found out in recent months with Target and Home Depot. So what we have to look is, how can we fix that security? And again, from a public cloud offering, it's less likely to happen as you move more toward your more control and more private cloud type technology. You'll see a much more secure and private areas. The problem with whatever you can develop to prevent or provide security and prevent data privacy breach, there's going to be someone out there that's going to try to break it, depending on how valuable that information is to the particular individual. So it's something to consider when you're going through and looking at each one of these different components as to why your particular organization is not moving to the cloud. There may be ways to prevent that. Next is compliance. There are regulatory expectations, and we're going to talk about those as we get to the points to consider section of the session. And what we're going to do is, our biggest concern in regulatory compliance, and who has control of the data. Cost and return on investment is always important and always what the organizations are looking for. But again, as we move to these private clouds, and in order to meet the security and privacy and compliance concerns of our industry, the return on investment for the organizations is stretching out much longer because the costs involved to meet the expectations for these different components. Priorities. Each of the organizations have many competing priorities in their in their IT portfolio, and putting one more project on the list is always a financial concern for your IT organizations. Next, we have culture. Culture is pretty interesting because a lot of folks are set in their ways, and although the technology portions of our organizations are looking to change and move forward, just because it's the latest and greatest, six-pack or slice of bread, most of our regulated organizations have a culture of limited risk, trying to minimize the risk. So things don't change overnight. It's certainly something that will enable strong leadership, vision to take its course and to provide a change in culture if that's necessary. And some say organizational capability. Are our IT organizations capable of making this transition to cloud-ready technologies? They may have a very strong presence internally, and it's not just looking at cloud technologies as moving servers off. There are a lot of other aspects that you have to look at as to whether or not they can support, because there are resources that need to be supported internally. We get into the bring your own device type of technologies, which is certainly up and coming, brings that organizational capability as you move more toward that cloud-ready organization. Market maturity. The market maturity for the public cloud is certainly, I believe, there, in my opinion. But when you move into some of our specialized applications in clinical trials, in manufacturing, in document management, they're not quite there yet from a maturity level. They're not quite capable of answering the questions that we have about security, about control of the and compliance of the processes that are running. And then last but not least, we have good old FUD. And FUD is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Even in the year of 2014, 2015, a lot of organizations do have the fear of moving into the cloud and losing control of their data or losing all of their data. They're uncertain as to whether or not the cloud is a fad. And it's just a coin to a phrase that we've been doing in the industry for a couple of years. It's just where the controls lie. I mean, I think if you go back to the graphic of who has the control, we've been using hosting providers for a number of years in the industry. So it's not something that's totally outrageous to move in that direction. But there's still, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not these cloud providers can provide the controls necessary for us to meet the regulatory compliance, security components of what our industry is typically looking for. So take a couple of seconds and we're going to put out a poll as to what are the reasons that would prevent you from moving to the cloud, or that have prevented you from moving to the cloud over the from a professional standpoint, I should say, not necessarily a personal standpoint, because it's a different type of data and different type of risk associated with that. So take a couple seconds and answer this poll if you could. All right, Megan, if you could close that and show us the results there. No one that says the fear and uncertainty and doubt. That's interesting. But security, privacy, and compliance, everyone, almost 80% of us have identified that as a very strong concern as to moving, and certainly will, in the points to consider component of the presentation, we'll certainly go through some of them. So, okay, you can close that up. Oop, you lost me. Megan, I think you paused the session. There we go. All right. So let's look at cloud computing and whether or not we can equate this to traditional outsourcing components of most organizations. So, as we've experienced in the pharmaceutical industry and drug development, outsourcing is permitted in our industry. And, across our drug development pipeline, there are a number of different areas where we do outsource our technologies. But the most of our outsourcing in the pharmaceutical industry is through drug discovery, preclinical and clinical research, as well as laboratory testing. These are the three main areas that we focus on. So, we'll keep that into mind. So we do focus on those types of outsourcing from a traditional pharmaceutical drug development process. Now let's look at this from a cloud perspective. So in the most case, sponsors can delegate these activities to third parties, but they are still accountable for the compliance component. And then there's, what we call the three-legged stool: governance, risk, and compliance. So the governance looks at purchasing controls and implementation controls and validation processes. There's the risk component that we try to mitigate through contract service level agreements and performance monitoring. And then there's the compliance, where you look at different codes of conduct and self-certifications, ISO, audits, third-party certification, how they manage corrective action and preventative action. But what the question I ask the group is, are these traditional GRC tools, as we know them, sufficient to ensure cloud vendor compliance? Can we use these controls to assure that these cloud vendors are compliant? So take a couple seconds and answer this question in your perspective, and we'll go through that. Okay, I'm going to close that up. Oh, they are. A couple people say yes, they are, and most people say no. Well, we're going to look at both sides to that. So if we do treat the cloud vendor as the same as every other vendor, then we do have that precedent for outsourcing regulated functions, and in some cases, depending upon where this cloud vendor falls into the regulated function, we can do this, and we can leverage those existing GRC controls to manage them. But there's two different answers here that we can go with. So a lot depends on the service, right, and what that service is. It may be different from all the other services provided by vendors that are in the traditional outsourcing models that we've used. And we go into the software as a service model where we can't control how that functionality is actually working. So some of these traditional purchasing controls may not work in cases, or there may be regulatory roadblocks that can't be met if the service is outsourced. And in this case, one of those regulatory roadblocks, if we do have data and data privacy and data that contains that personal identifiable health information, we can shift that across one continent. But if we ship it outside, we can't meet those regulations. They can't be certain that we can meet those regulations. But in a lot of cases, there's what we talked about before: who has the control? There may be a lot of different ways that we can't see how the laws will be predicted in the future and how they'll be interpreted. What we try to do is we try to control. And here, when we look at who has these controls across these multiple deployment models, we then have to look at how those different laws apply to how we're using those systems. All right? We can, the short answer, I believe, is yes, we can use CRC to manage a cloud environment. But there are things that need to be considered. There are some legal aspects that still need to be considered, which make it a little bit more due diligence that has to be executed. I want to look at a couple of different processes here. So, when we look at, an active agent versus self-service, and here the example I'm using is a CRO runs clinical trial processes in-house within its own clinical trial management system. So it's using that particular software as a data processor, just processing data. The next base is whether or not we're using this, these servers to upload and process data on the cloud. Very similar type of, since the traditional is internal, working within those clinical trial management. Second bullet is drives more to those cloud-based applications. Very similar, but different processing places. So as we start looking at whether or not, we look at this as a customized service, a service which is, a set of actions or solutions that is customized, or a commoditized utility, something that's to satisfy needs or wants. So regulated industries have, many different levels and many different types of controls to manage data and data activity. We have privacy laws. We have 21 CFR Part 11. Annex 11 is out there. There's quality system regulations. So if we're going to truly achieve, the cost savings that the cloud environment is going to or should provide us, we have to be able to, leverage these different regulations out there and have the vendors understand the importance of them. And in my opinion, it's no different across industries, across different verticals. Managing data and managing systems is pretty much the same regardless of the industry, or should be according to good IT practices. Should be just about the same. But when you're trying to become fast and nimble, the I's aren't always dotted, the T's aren't always crossed. So they're not able to keep the cost savings down and to accommodate our needs at the same time, because they're cutting corners in that public cloud. They're missing things. They're not documenting their processes. Their training isn't as sufficient as we would like. Security controls aren't in place and aren't always followed. So if they would continue to execute these processes as they've been developed and designed, there really wouldn't be much difference between the two. But unfortunately, they're not managed the same. So, in order to as I say, achieve the cost savings, vendors need to prepackage and standardize their services, but they're standardizing their services at a lower level of expectation from our industry, which is extremely important, which just gives that apprehension into moving to the cloud. Now let's look at some of the points to consider when we start looking at these cloud vendors. What are those components that we're supposed to do? I have a couple things here. So there are multiple stakeholders in this cloud process, and what we're looking, each one of the stakeholders have their own particular focus. You have your cloud vendor and provider, the data center, more or less your software, or your platform providers, and then you have your application vendor, which could be different or could be the same. And in some cases, you have third and fourth party relationships going on between a different application provider, different cloud hardware provider, a different IT staffing organization, and then your individual user and organization that you're the sponsor organization. So a lot of different stakeholders have a lot of different focuses here. You have your quality groups, you have your legal, and there's others as well. Your internal and external business users, which could be, if you're running a clinical trial, could be someone involved at the study site, or if you're preclinical, could be a CRO. And then you have your internal technology groups. So all of these different stakeholders are part of this process. I guess the next poll we're going to do, what is your particular role? So let me we can close that up. Now, as we go through the next few slides, there's a lot of these, depending on what role you are, you're going to take a different perspective on each of these different bullets that we're going to go through over the next couple of slides. So we don't have any vendors of the cloud-based technology, but we do have a lot of business units. We have IT, and we have QA. No legal folks on board. They're an important group that we have to interact with. So the first thing we're going to look at is service level agreements. And they're certainly the contracts between the service providers and the users or owners of that system that define the support and procedures that are going to be in place. The hosting contract itself often addresses the compensation component, but it doesn't necessarily address all the different managed activities, change control and so forth. So as we get into looking at these service level agreements, there are 6 bullets here that we're going to go through or 7 bullets that we'll go through that are extremely important in understanding who's going to be doing what. And a lot of it is data backup and data restore. Who's doing backups? How often are they done? And how can we get that data restored? This falls into the classic case of disaster recovery. If something were to happen, how do we recover our data? Next portion of a service level agreement that we look at is data center facilities. What are those staffing concerns? How do we vet employees? and contracted resources if that's the case. What is the security? What are the environmental conditions of that particular organization and facility? We look at server and network availability, uptimes, downtimes. Do we have accounting in there for time zone differences, different holidays? Certainly all important components if you do have a problem. Service level agreements have to contain some component of change management. How are changes being made on both the hardware and software component? And again, depending on where you fall from an infrastructure as a service or platform or software as a service, you still need to know what those changes are going to be and what the notification process is. How long before that change notice and the change occurrence will happen. Also, as part of that change management process, will you have access to previous versions, previous releases of that software that you have used in the past that you know work, and can you gain access to them? What are the problem management processes? How are response times identified? How are things prioritized for your particular organization? The application availability, uptimes, talks about load management and minimum performance. How much is going to be on a particular server that you're using? And will you be able to manage, will the system be able to manage your application at peak times? And then last but not least, you have data administration. Who has security access? What are those access controls? Who has access to databases? How is data health checks managed? And is there a chance of that data being corrupted by any chance? Is there redundancy in data? And it falls back up to data backups as well. So this is all part of service level agreements. This is all all components that need to be identified prior to signing that contract at the end of the day. When we start looking at our industry and regulatory requirements or just general requirements for data centers, qualified infrastructure. Are those systems qualified? Standard operating procedures. Are they in place? Training and personnel. Is everyone trained in their procedures? Do they know what they have to do? Are they trained in the service level agreements? They understand what their service delivery model is. And then also, if we're working in a software as a service for a validated application, are those applications validated? And last but not least, a colleague of mine brought this up a few years ago. When we look at regulated electronic record keeping controls, they fall back to a lot of these are SOPs though, and falls back into some of your other service level agreement components. So part of that is talks about record integrity, and we look at SOPs on electronic record keeping, your compliance program, your validation program. How do you qualify infrastructure? How do you ensure that that infrastructure meets the minimum specifications as identified by the vendors? What are our security programs and your training programs? We look at record retention, SOPs to focus on backup and restore, problem reporting, business continuity, and disaster recovery planning. How long do we retain those records and processes? And then record availability. Look up backup and restore, business continuity, disaster recovery. And the two at the end here, record retention policy, which is, falls into the record retention components. How long do we keep records, and how do we archive records? And these are all things to be considered when you're working with a data center. Do they have the ability to archive data? Because they're running out of space. Is that how they manage? Change and configuration management processes, very, very important. There's a few questions that we ask ourselves. How will these applications be managed? And we talked about this as part of a service level agreement. But more importantly, do they have procedures to support this? Who decides when? Or is it on a time schedule, or is it whenever the organization feels that the software can be updated? Does the data center make autonomous decisions without notifying any of its particular clients and customers? Are there logs kept? That's very, very important to understand. And again, these are questions that as the regulated industry we're focusing on and trying to ensure that there are processes in place to meet our expectations. And when we look at security, again, here's where some of that apprehension comes, right? How safe and secure is our data? Can others change system configuration? So if someone can change a system configuration, they can modify who has access to data and what that access is to possibly delete that data. When you look at the multi-tenant architecture, can others log into your system? Is your data segregated enough so that you don't have any possibility of that data being breached? Data center employees, are they trained? Have they been trained? Are they trusted? Have they been vetted? What type of process do they go in bringing folks on? And you look at, I mentioned this earlier briefly, when you look at the multiple stakeholders, but sometimes you have a host provider of services, you have a vendor or software developer, and there could possibly be some breakdown in their relationship that could affect how your data and how your system operates. So being aware of that is extremely important to ensure the consistent use of your application and your process within the cloud. Talk about some of the SOPs that run across both organizations, whether it be cloud provider or the sponsor. Obviously when you're looking at validated and validated applications, both organizations need to have validation policies in place. Both need to have security procedures in place, training and change management as well. A cloud provider has that routine and preventative maintenance activity. Also have your backup and restore activities, archiving, disaster recovery processes, and also how to manage configuration within that system. But the one thing on the sponsor side that's out there is business continuity. If for some unknown reason you can't use this system, how does your business continue to operate? And then your operational use procedures. We look a little bit about qualification and validation. Who's doing what. Traditionally when you're looking at to qualify environments, you're focused on individual machines. Now we're looking at architecture, data centers, and qualifying to make sure that each of those meet different regulations and quality controls, and quality systems. When you look at validation activities, focuses on the testing process. The one important thing about validation, it requires the qualification of those services, whether or not it's a dedicated IT function within your organization or it's a cloud provider. You look at the different activities in these processes. Your cloud provider could validate an application. It will produce a lot of the same deliverables that we would expect in a traditional IT hosted, internal hosted application. You're going to produce functional requirements. There's hardware and software requirements that are out there. Different configuration. You have installation and operational qualification activities that happen, and that happens all on the vendor side. But then again, there still are, that isn't a turnkey process, and validation is never turnkey in a cloud environment. The sponsor also has a number of deliverables that they need to produce in order to have a fully validated system. Risk assessments to go through each of those components that we spoke previously in the slides. The supplier assessment. What are our particular requirements? And then testing around whether or not the system meets those requirements. We have to have our use SOPs and our summary reports. So when a cloud software as a service is utilized, it's not a turnkey validated application. There's still a lot of sponsor components that we have to focus on. All right, now in summary, we have a lot of different challenges, and they're never going to go away. And every time we overcome one of the challenges, another one rears its ugly head. But in a lot of cases, cloud can produce many, many benefits, and certainly reduce cost and greater agility to bring different systems up online quickly. The one thing that I will strongly encourage everyone, continue to track the fast-changing landscape. There's a lot of different technologies out there, a lot of different challenges that are becoming, in commonplace that are being overcome, with security and privacy, and a lot of good companies out there doing a lot of good work. So you can't go away and not continue to keep a pulse on this industry. Always have to assess in implementing any one of these technologies, your intended use. What are the associated risks and business impacts of using these particular tools? And around that is, the risk and security, legal, and quality. And how you're going to mitigate a lot of those problems is with the service level agreement. But last but not least, security is a priority overall in any of these cloud-based applications. So a number of references that were used, and you're going to get a copy of these slides once we finish up the session. You'll be emailed a copy of these slides. And then I'd like to thank a number of the Society of Quality Assurance Computer Validation Initiative Committee members that have, over the past year or so have contributed, either components of this slide deck. One thing I would like to note, and you can check my webpage in the future for more on this, but the Society of Quality Assurance CVIC group is going to be holding a cloud symposium in September of 2015. You can go to Society of Quality Assurance, sqa.org, and check my website. And it's going to be a 2-day symposium. We're looking at introducing a number of perspectives on cloud technologies with vendors, as well as industry perspective of implementing different types of cloud technologies within the different organizations. So with that, I ask if there are any questions. I don't see anything coming up.
Craig, we only have, Joe, we only have about a minute left in today's session. I did have one quick question come in.
Okay.
It was an interesting point when you were talking about, CRO sponsor collaboration. What about in instances where a CRO might use a cloud provider? Do they have to make the sponsor aware of that, and what type of governance would they want to put in place for that case?
Yeah, I believe that, in your due diligence of that CRO, you're going to audit that CRO, and if they have the GRC components in place within their organization, just as you having the GRC components within your organization, and ensuring that those components are being met and vetted throughout their selection process of their vendors as well. You should be okay. The telltale truth is, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. If you get that data and you have questions about that data, depending on what they are, and whether they're data providers or providing full service CRO, certainly as you go through a clinical trial and you're monitoring that clinical trial, you should be able to see if there are problems and try to raise those problems early in the process.
Great, thanks. Well, we are just at 11 o'clock, so we're out of time. As Joe mentioned, I will be following up with a link to download a copy of today's presentation. I'll be sending that out later on today. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to respond to that email, or Joe's contact information is on the slide display right now if you would like to send him an email or visit his website. So with that, I'm going to close up. Thank you so much for attending today, and thank you for your participation in the polls. It's definitely helpful. And we hope you enjoyed today's session. Have a good one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.